Sue, dear friend, dear colleague. I'm so glad to have you on our Priceless Advice with leaders of volunteers for leaders of volunteers. And you and I, when we're in the same place at the same time, usually San Diego, we try to have lunch at a Thai place or hang out or have coffee. But that was in the before time, so we haven't seen each other in person in a couple of years, I think.
Hmm.
So I'm really delighted to have you on the program today, and especially talking about a topic of one of your many wonderful blogs, which is kind of nice and when nice isn't good or defining nice. So feel free to tell us what's going on with the blog and what's been going on with you lately.
Great. Well, thank you. And as you mentioned, I feel like I'm in conversation with you a lot because I'm listening to your videos and checking things out. So I'm really excited to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I've been really thinking about how do I translate some of the research that I have conducted about volunteer value. How do we translate that so that it's really practitioner friendly and usable for those who are in the field really thinking about where they're going with this, what kind of tools and resources and exercises can they do with their teams. And I guess the benefit of being on lockdown or quarantine all and not traveling has been getting to reach people in new pockets of the country and even the world. And also thinking about, what does this look like for us today in terms of the racial reckoning that's going on, and what does that look like in terms of volunteerism. And thinking also about, a lot of the ways, where are the intersections between volunteerism and volunteer impact and the way we talk about volunteers, and how do we do that in more equitable ways and ways that can really honor the work that's going on in all of its wholeness, not just things that we can count. So that's been a little bit about what I've been working on these days. And it's been a joy to connect with so many people who are thinking really intentionally about how they're telling the story of volunteerism in their, not only in their organizations, but also within their communities too.
In your deeper research, have you hit kind of pain points with leadership, or do you think it's easier or harder for leaders of organizations to kind of make these changes in the last couple of years? Are you finding any resistance, or are you finding more openness to like examining what does nice mean, what does good mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many ways to go with that. I think that we're still really on the front end of the conversations, based on what I'm seeing. But I think there's real potential, particularly in thinking about the role of volunteer engagement in this kind of work. For so long, volunteerism has been this nice kind of thing on the side where we can tout it when we need a good story or a feel good, warm, fuzzy kind of thing. And I think that's kind of kept it on the margins. And we have overlooked all the real power of what can come from volunteerism. And so I think as organizations are, if and when they're ready to get serious about these conversations on justice and belonging, and to shift this more from a DEI compliance kind of standpoint, diversity, equity, inclusion, and to think about, well, how are we engaging the community? Volunteerism is one of the ways we do that. So if we start thinking not just about volunteer engagement, but community engagement, volunteerism is one of those portals into the organization. And it's a portal that can open up all sorts of participation in terms of not just direct service, but it can be on fundraising, it can be advocacy, of course, it can be taking what we learn inside of an organization and bringing it back out into the community and saying, here's what's happening. When we get this right as an organization, it can lead to an increased sense of transparency and trust, which we know that the research tells us that even in the nonprofit sector, the trust is declining, and there's a gap between different communities and how they perceive nonprofits. And so volunteerism, if we really invest in that and think critically about not just how are we bringing people in to do these preconceived tasks that are sort of prepackaged and easy, which is important. How are we bringing people in and meeting them where they are, but how are we also having a conversation about getting their voice, getting their participation in deeper and more meaningful ways that aren't just a one-time kind of thing. We often talk about, for example, done in a day service. I think it would be more helpful to think about that as begun in a day service. How do we use those one-time opportunities as an entry point into, here are all the ways, if you had a good time today, or if this felt like meaningful work, here are all the ways that you can engage with us. And how do we begin a relationship that we really can cultivate that? So it's not just this transactional, check the box, I can pat myself on the back kind of thing. And I think the other piece for me, and like you said, is that really taking a hard look at our sector. And I wonder, like you said, when I go to these volunteer conferences, there are a lot of people who look like me and are coming from fairly privileged backgrounds. Nice white ladies are doing their best.
Right.
And I wonder to what extent we're curating volunteer experiences for people who look like us or who have the kind of experiences that we have. And bringing new voices into those conversations, not just as, can you give us a little feedback, but how do we really think about when we're serving a community, for example, what would a good volunteer look like,
right,
according to that community, not necessarily according to our definitions and traditions. So there are lots of ways to go with that. I'll stop there for a moment to.
It's all good, and we're here for a deep dive and all the bits and pieces. Nice doesn't mean that it's nice for everybody.
Right. And I think that there comes then a responsibility for those of us who are looking at this work perhaps in a different way. Mm-hmm. How do we use whatever privilege we have to have these conversations? So this is a much harder conversation if you are a person of color. This is a harder conversation if you are new to the field. This is a harder conversation if you're coming from any kind of identity or group that's been othered. Yes. And so I think that one of the things that it does is it gives me a responsibility to think about, how am I using my voice and how am I bringing up some of these issues, for example. And like you said, how do we help provide some insight into, well, what does this feel like to someone who doesn't look like our traditional volunteer corps, right? I mean, I think sometimes we think about, oh, well, we want to diversify and we bring people in and then it doesn't work out and we go, oh, see, didn't work out, rather than thinking about what is it about what they encountered when they were here that might not have been welcoming, that might not have felt like this was a place for them. And sometimes that's as simple as, this is a group that knows each other well, has been together for a long time, but that can come across as real cliquish sort of behavior, even to someone who shares identities with that longtime group. And that can be a really off-putting sort of thing that just says, okay, this is for people who've been around a long time. I don't know the language or the culture yet. And so I think, taking a step back and really kind of peeling back these layers on the issue. And I think that sometimes in volunteerism, we think, oh, nobody really gets us. We don't have a whole lot of authority and power. And that's true to some extent. I mean, MAVA has done some research saying that the volunteer managers have less authority than, say, fundraisers or program managers even. However, I think that there are a lot of places where we can exercise some control and power. And I think about all of the ways that we're making decisions day in and day out. So what makes for a good volunteer? What does the screening process look like? Who is considered to be qualified to do the work of our organization? What kind of process do we have for placement? I mean, every place that we're making a decision is a place that we are exercising influence and power. And it's a way for us to think about, oh, okay, well, who's at the front of the room? Who invited people to the room in the first place? How are we sitting around that room, and who has whose voices matter most? That's the way we start to reveal some of the dynamics that can tell us whether we really are creating spaces of welcome I read the book called Radical Welcome by Reverend Stephanie Spellers, and she really just flipped this on its head for me and was like, you know, how do we create a space that might have been, the doors have been shut, forget about getting a seat at the table, there was no way to even get in the room.
Yeah, or the building, or the down the street.
Right,
Yeah.
right, because it's very clear about where you go. And so while she was writing toward congregations, there were enormous ramifications and implications for how we do our work in volunteerism too. So just great questions that have been helping me think, oh, I really do have influence in these ways. And as a consultant or as a trainer, how am I really kind of pulling apart the work that I'm doing to raise these issues with the folks that I'm working with, or asking hard questions about the way I've been doing things and who determined that was the right way to do it.
Exactly. And I think there's a ton of conscious and unconscious gatekeeping, because we're always in the balance of being really recognized in every other sector as a profession, and that requires some standards like a CVA or certain degrees or certain best practices, and coming to an understanding with the major demographic of that our sector is comprised of looking like us, that a lot of the same best practices or nice things or good things are built on inherently unjust systems, and we're programmed with thinking that things are okay that benefit a certain group that looks like us, and that's a very natural thing. It's like, I am comfortable with my group of people, and I was actually just talking to Barry about this idea that primate brains, even human brains, can't really comprehend a village bigger than 150 people circle of friends. It really starts to get hard to truly empathize and care about more than about 150 individuals in our sphere. And it really takes that intentional work. And I talk about, the 3 C's of happy volunteers, and my idea that was kind of going to follow up on that ties into your niceness and other people's good definitions is, happy doesn't mean rainbows and puppies and smiles all the times. It actually is, it's a stand-in word for, someone having an enriching, fulfilling, meaningful experience. And there's ups and downs within that. And I tend to like punchy titles of things. It's just kind of how my brain works and my writing goes. But that doesn't mean that it's on the surface. And so I think that that's really important. And I really appreciated getting a preview draft of your nice blog, because I think it's important for us to, like you said, tear apart and open up and examine these really common words or phrases or ideas, not only that volunteers are nice to have, or that all volunteers are nice people. And ooh, you and I could do a whole next year's points of light on why that isn't true. That isn't true. But just, this idea that sometimes there's this really uncomfortable work to do, but that the reward of everyone feeling comfortable, including the person who had to get a little bit outside of their comfort zone initially, that actually pays off. It's such a valuable payoff for everyone involved. And to your point of the power that we have in using it, I know you and I both like to remind people that as leaders of volunteers, even if you're a department of one, you probably have the most headcount of anyone in your organization. You are in charge of the most people. Therefore, whether your executive leadership is able to recognize it or not, or you can advocate for yourself for promotion or other resources, just grab onto that power, that you have the influence within, not over, because we're going to do a power over to it, but you can influence and harness this incredible workforce that you're leading. You're quite frankly leading, whether you're a volunteer or a paid employee, because there's some all volunteer organizations that do incredible, and mutual aid groups that do incredible grassroots work, and kind of thinking about it from that grassroots perspective versus that upper class, somewhat privileged gatekeeping perspective.
Right. And I think there's this piece that in our push to get more people to volunteer, we've somehow really reinforced that sunshine and rainbows kind of approach.
Exactly.
Where, it's all about the volunteers. We want the that there's this idea that volunteerism has to be fun for people to be attracted to it. They have We know you have all sorts of things you can do with your time. So we need to make volunteerism almost competitive with leisure activities or work activities or family activities, and rather than what you said, right, that volunteerism can be a space of meaningful work, of rewarding work. It's a way to express our values, and sometimes that is really valuable to kind of step back and say, well, why am I doing this? Is it really effective? Is this the best use of my skills? Is this organization treating the community that's being served as well as it's treating its donors, as well as it's treating its volunteers? And I think that's where the piece in volunteerism, particularly because a lot of people get pulled into this, they've been tagged as a people person.
Yes.
And so they said, okay, well, you'll be great with the volunteers. We need somebody who can be nice to the volunteers. And of course, we want to be considerate of the volunteers, but I think of a Venn diagram where we're thinking about what does the community need first and foremost? What are the volunteers interested in and capable of doing? And what does our staff or our volunteer team, if you're an all volunteer organization, have the capacity to do? And that sweet spot right in the middle of all three of those things really can be our guide. And so sometimes we can have these experiences. For example, a colleague of mine is part of this association, and one of the things they did at the Christmas holiday was go sing to a bunch of kids who were in a home for foster youth. And as she's sitting at like the group showed up, and they're in all of their holiday finery, and there must have been about 10 to 12 volunteers, and there were probably 5 or 6 youth. And as they're singing, and the youth are not necessarily singing along a lot, and my friend was saying, you know, I just got really uncomfortable at one point. And the person who had coordinated this, I went over to her and she said, you know, is this like, were the kids mandated to be here? Is this good for them? Yeah. And the person kind of launched into the usual spiel that we do, the nice one. And then she said, well, why do you ask? And so they had a more real conversation about, well, we knew that this group was important. Sometimes you give us money. We knew that this was a valuable thing to do for the volunteers, and so we put it together. But one of the things, as the volunteers were leaving, one of them was like, oh, that one teenager was just sitting in the corner and he had his earbuds in, and it came off really judgmentally. That experience was really all about the volunteers and not about those teens who don't have a lot of voice and agency already in their own lives. And now we set it up so that they were sort of forced to go through this experience that took away even more voice and agency, so someone else could feel good who had a lot of privilege. So I think these are just the kinds of things where we can start to look at not just being nice to the volunteers, but how do we craft service that really is good for the people that we're serving, that they would say would be valuable, that they feel energized or nourished or refreshed by, and that we sometimes have to take off that niceness, put it on the shelf, and say, let's have a real conversation.
Yeah.
And maybe that group comes back this holiday and they say, you know what, we want to fess up to this. This isn't really what the teens want to do, but we would love to partner with you. Can we have a conversation about something, how we might come to a different way to engage your participants in a way that will be really helpful for the teens as well?
And I think that's the conversation that we all need to be changing to have, is that instead of, well, the last few years, our sector has definitely been all about, of course, transformation, not transactions, transformation. You and I both know that out at day-to-day practitioner level, it's still very transactional because a lot of funders and a lot of structures are set up to reward a transactional box checking system and behavior that isn't always, you know, beneficial for the community that you're in or that you're working with. There's been a lot of white savior, we're talking at you, we are giving things to you, and you should be grateful. So yeah, I probably would also be the broody teenager in the back with my sunglasses on and like listening to Tears for Fears, 80s joke, in the back or something, or Depeche Mode, and just being like, no, this isn't, you know, I have to be here for my social worker or whatever. And really saying, do they want us to even do anything with their time, or do they just want time to do what they want to do with their friends, or their mode of things? And I think that that syndrome is still really ingrained. And so it's up to us to take a look at, are we talking with people? Are we having these sincere and genuine conversations about what works in the community? And like you said, meeting people where they are. And FISA talks about that, just meeting people where they are and whatever they can give or whatever they want to take from the agency as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, I mean, you talked about relationships a couple times just in that last piece. And that's one of the things that, I've come across this idea of right relationship in a number of areas. And I think it makes for a really valuable way, kind of a guiding principle. So if I'm moving forward and say these volunteers come in and they say they're really excited to do something, if I do that and it's good for them, is it going to put me in right relationship with the community I'm serving? Is it putting me in right relationship with the staff who will have to be helping and supervising that work? Is it putting me in right relationship with the commitments that we already have to other parts or partners in the community? And so I think realizing that, and that's really one of the toughest parts of being in a nonprofit or even a government agency that's working with volunteers, of course, is that we don't have the luxury of just focusing on one audience.
Right.
We have to consider multiple audiences. And again, a lot of times the funders, there's this pull toward the funders because they've got the most power. But I think when we think about right relationship, it gives us the permission. It really gives us a mandate to say, what does our community need first and foremost? How does everything flow from that? What are we doing as an agency? Are we aligned with that purpose? And are our volunteer efforts contributing to that purpose? And everything else flows from that. So I think that that's one of the things for me that's been really helpful in terms of this notion of right relationship, or also the radical welcome. How are we going beyond just being nice and kind and kind of saying like you said, the surface kinds of things? How are we actually thinking about how do we cultivate relationship? How do we get beyond pleasantries? How are we helping create connections between people who are coming to volunteer? How are we cultivating connections to the cause? How are we helping educate them about what the issue looks like? Helping them to see beyond the sound bites and the headlines and the clickbait that we see, and saying, here, we want to really introduce to you what food insecurity looks like, or what it means to be unsheltered, or what it means to be like a youth in the foster system. And we hope that you'll share that story with others too, so that they can get a better insight and view into that. And some of those conversations will be hard because people that might challenge some of their assumptions. And especially when we've framed it as charity, where we do two things, that can be a difficult thing. And so that's why I think starting where people are, saying, yes, we're glad you're here, and we want to help introduce you to all of these other things. And so I think, and I've been really influenced by reading The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker. And she talks about the a gathering starting not at the moment of when we actually come together, but the moment of discovery. And so setting up an expectation of, here's what's going to happen at this volunteer project. I've just been applying all of our stuff to thinking about volunteer projects, particularly those one-time sorts of things. So how do we signal to people, we're not just going to be patting ourselves on the back and cheering at the end of it. We want to celebrate what we've accomplished, but we're also going to have a conversation about how are we connecting you to the other volunteers, or how are we connecting you into something bigger in the community? How are we supporting you and thinking about how does the service align with your values, or align with how you want to show up in the community? And so that we're going to have some conversations, and some of those might be new for you, but we hope that this will be inviting and that you'll be game for that. And by doing that ahead of time, in the position description perhaps, or the posting, saying that again at the beginning of the session. So then when we roll around to do a debrief at the end, it's not surprising, and that people can show up to that more fully than they might have if they thought it was just going to be the raw cheerleading version of volunteerism. And some people still are only going to want the cheerleading version. But I think that, again, it's incumbent on those of us who can see that there are some issues here to start thinking about how do we change our behavior change, that it will have lots of more positive ripples out into the community.
Yes, and to all of that, with and kind of tagging into right relationships and the radical welcome, and the gathering as the discovery point, and letting people, everyone know, not just everyone watching, but sharing that that doesn't mean that, and that those things can happen in a 5-minute interaction, in a
Mm-hmm.
remote virtual interaction. Those things can happen in a 50-year lifer. You know, people are sometimes buried in their, you know, they put in
Mm-hmm.
their will that, like, I would like to wear my docent vest, or my, you know, my Getty Museum docent vest. Please bury me in my Getty Museum docent vest, and things like that. So any so don't think about that as having to be attached to time, because I have found in conversations about these things with colleagues at conferences that there's a lot of, like, well, what can I do just today? Or it's like, actually, all of this, but people will show up and self-select for how much they're digging deep into it. So if they want a
Mm-hmm.
surface rah-rah of a hashtag trash challenge, spontaneous,
Mm-hmm.
here's where you show up on Saturday, just sign in real quick, but here's what we're going to do, and here's why it's important in the description, and people show up, and that's that. Yes, some people might want to say, how else can I be involved on a regular basis? And some people might be like, every 2 years I show up to this beach and I pick up trash for 5 hours, and that's all that's what fits into my life. What are some other topics that are just kind of, you know, really burning in your mind and your heart that we want to raise awareness for in our sector right now?
Great question. I actually have a running Excel sheet that's probably got 500 lines in it now, that because my little sticky notes and pieces of paper, which we're collecting, and all of the, like, dust bunnies, except in the corners of my desk, and I just dump everything in there. I have actually this vision of creating sort of a community kind of mind map where I can
Mm,
put these ideas out and then do, like, co-creation with folks. So I don't know, maybe stay tuned. That
okay.
playing with what that might look like. Is it a Padlet? Is it some other kind of mind map software? But there's, like, all of these things, like accountability, because I'm finding with the clients I've been talking to that that keeps coming up in about 6 or 7 different shades of that.
Yes.
The other piece, and what I often get asked to speak about, is volunteer value and the contributions,
Hmm.
and that's where I really, I guess I went the full Dr. Sue on. Um, and I think, what was interesting coming out of that was just this idea, we have these, what counts as the industry standards, volunteer numbers and hours and their financial value. I see that as a floor, not a ceiling.
Right.
And too often, other folks say, well, we check the box. And I think, again, and as we think about sort of nice, this idea that volunteers are nice but not necessary, or the volunteer engagement function is nice but not necessary, is because we have communicated volunteer value just in terms of their volume. Like, if I came to your organization when you were with one of the conservation organizations and I said, tell me about your effectiveness, you would never just tell me how many employees you had, the number of hours you worked last year, and your payroll budget.
Right.
And I'd
It's
say,
not just
okay,
the raw numbers. Yeah.
right. What did all of those people do? What did that budget yield? What were the results? What did you accomplish? And so one of the things for me is really just thinking about, how do we align, excuse me, our performance indicators, which are not always numbers, with our mission, so that we are showing up in the volunteer space as being, so we're seen as essential, that volunteers are critical to the functioning not only of our mission, but our operations, as well as community awareness and trust and transparency in the community, all of those kinds of things. And the other piece for me, especially kind of coming back to where we started at the beginning of the conversation, was thinking about these ideas about who is our sector made of. So, for example, we see protests, we see activism. The folks who are showing up in those spaces look very different than the folks who show up at a volunteer management conference.
Yes.
And so this idea that in volunteer management, we've borrowed ideas from business, we've borrowed ideas from human resources, and those have been really valuable. We haven't necessarily been borrowing models from community organizing or activism, or even models like the commons. and I've done some of my research into gift economies as well. So this idea that communities can come together, create their own protocols and guidelines for how they want to be in community with each other, and that they can be leaderful movements, that there's not just one or two people who are at the head of the room or the head of the organization dictating how this goes, and the gatekeeping, like you mentioned earlier. So I'm really curious about how do we start to look to other fields or other types of service, informal service, community organizing, to really think, to help us see maybe some of the assumptions we've built into volunteer engagement, and go, oh, well, maybe there's another way to do that. So those are a few of the things I'm thinking about that get plugged into that Excel sheet.
500 field Excel sheet.
Yeah. I've had it for a long time. It's not like I just put that together last week.
I would be impressed. I'm impressed, but either way. And that's definitely been a deep area of interest, because I came out of my teens and early 20s in intense AIDS activism, intense LGBTQIA plus Two-Spirit activism, because we always expand our acronyms quite a bit in the family and the community. And seeing what was happening in the late 80s through the 90s in that stuff, and where we are today, and some steps forward, many steps forward, some steps backwards. I naturally, when I got into this field in 2002, I naturally used kind of those models, like an ACT UP model or a mutual aid model and a grassroots model. And my uncle helped found the AIDS quilt in Long Beach. And so it's kind of my whole, and environmental stuff. So it's, to me, that's come naturally, and it's been fascinating in the 20 years of this career, of seeing like, so there's so many models of best practice that were never built around deep community engagement, deep community communication and involvement, and trust and transparency. So that's a huge topic for me as well. It really resonates. And I don't know, I'm not making any promises to anybody, but maybe that's what Sue and I talk about when we finally go present together, is this idea of using models that really work in the community for our systems of community engagement. And it seems really obvious to me, but I've learned it's not at all obvious, and it's not much in practice. So I'd love to do that. And I'm just so grateful we just got to chat and be serious and silly together, as always happens when we're around. So thank you so much for joining the conversation in Priceless Advice and your wonderful Tuesday tips. And do you want to plug anywhere you're going to be virtually, or anything coming up, or can I just steer people to Volunteer Commons, your site?
Love to have folks visit Volunteer Commons, which is my blog, and feel free to comment and let me know, push back on it, say what you like, pushing that submit button as you do with publish or your videos. Even it's like, does anybody read it? What do they think? Do they
am I yelling into the void?
Do they hate and love it? Right. I'm kind of lacking that physical contact. But the other piece is that I'll be fortunate to be part of the volunteer management hybrid conference that you've been part of for a number of years.
That's
Dana.
true. Yes.
So that is in October, and sites they're accepting registrations for sites that want to live stream that. Lots of great. It just feels like a real honor, and I'm humbled to be part of the lineup to learn from and with the rest of the speakers. And FISA will be moderating that this year.
Wonderful. Well, now I know that I'm putting this Priceless Advice video out the first week of October or the end of September, so we can properly plug the hybrid conference, because it's near and dear to our hearts. And I'm so glad to see FISA tag in on hosting that the last couple of years, not only just being local to Toronto and such a wonderful person and expert in her own, but especially this year, the 2021 topic of diversity, equity, inclusion, access, justice, belongingness, and all that great stuff. So I'll definitely tune into that. And again, all the things we say on the YouTubes, hit like and subscribe so you can be alerted to our newest videos. And thank you, Dr. Sue, and I hope we can safely have Thai food for lunch again in person somewhere here in California as soon as possible.
Yes, fingers crossed for that. Thanks for the opportunity to take the deep dive. That was fun.